Well, welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see such a great turnout. We know this is a really interesting topic, and we're really glad you're here. My name is Lisa Hegarty. I'm with the Litchfield Heritage Center. You may also know us as the Litchfield Park Historical Society and Museum. We're located at the corner of Litchfield and Camelback Roads. We're in a little cottage there. But there's a ton of history and information, and we hope that you take the time to stop by. I just want to take a moment to thank the City of Goodyear and the Georgia T. Lord Library for partnering with us so that we can bring this presentation to you today. This presentation is part of our Heritage Lecture Series, which explores our local culture and history, largely here in the Southwest Valley or Arizona, some national history. So that ties into what our organization is about, which is focusing on bringing people together through the history, arts, and culture of the Southwest Valley. We are the cultural institution here locally, and our mission is to preserve and collect and interpret that history and also highlight our culture and arts as well. And so traditionally, or in the past, we've been mainly focused on Litchfield Park, but we are a more regional organization now, and we are incorporating the stories of Goodyear, Avondale, and Tolleson, and the immediately, surrounding areas. So we also have some additional lectures coming up. So on July 20th, we will have a talk about water in the Southwest Valley. And it talks about, we'll have a representative from the Buckeye Water Conservation Drainage District here, and that'll be 10 o'clock, July 20th. And he'll be talking about water in the Southwest Valley, its impact on our growth and the agriculture and so forth. And then we'll have another presentation coming up in September. September 21st, which talks about the women who served behind the scenes in World War II. So lots of interesting topics coming up. So we cover a whole range of areas when we do our presentations. So I certainly hope, if you're here today, you're clearly interested in history, you're clearly interested in where you live, you clearly want to know more about where you live, and maybe you have a strong connection already, so I'm sure you would really enjoy stopping by our museum. There's many, many more stories and threads of history that connect to this area. And we also host classes, we have cultural events, we have educational resources. So if you're at all interested, again, like Karen was encouraging you to do, we certainly would like you to visit the table after our presentation for additional information about who we are and what we do. And certainly encourage you to sign up for our email list. A number of you have asked if this presentation will be recorded. We're recording it and getting it online later on our YouTube channel, and one of the ways we'll notify people is through email and social media. So definitely check out our website, sign up for our email, that sort of thing, so you can stay in the loop if you're interested. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. Karen Krause is a native of Phoenix and has lived in Waddell for 30 years. During that time, she has been researching the history of Waddell, Arizona and the White Tank Mountains. As the local historian for the White Tank Mountain Conservancy, Karen is a regular presenter for the Conservancy and hopes to document the history of the mountains and to promote the Conservancy's mission to protect the mountains and their natural and cultural resources. Karen is the author of the White Tank Mountains Field Guide, which has just published a second edition. The guide is an introduction to the Sonoran Desert with chapters on the most common plants that you'll encounter and animals, along with information on geology, cultural history, and invasive plants. Karen currently serves on the board of directors for the Litchfield Park Historical Society. Her recent history projects include documenting the old Waddell Ranch site at Cotton Lane and Indian School Roads, which included oral interviews and a collection of historic photographs, which will become part of the Historical Society's archives. And heading the project, currently she's working to head the project to nominate the Colonel Dale Bumstead Talweeby Ranch as a historic district, on the National Registry of Historic Places. So definitely an advocate for history and preservation, and we're so glad to have her presenting with us today. Please join me in welcoming Karen Krause.
Let's see if I can do this without hurting myself. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to listen to me rap on about my favorite topic. I grew up in East Phoenix, like she said, and my husband Tom and I and our daughter Liz moved out to Waddell about 35 years ago. Our daughter Liz was about 7 at the time, and she asked me, so now that we're out here, are we Waddellians or Waddellites? Well, I told her we're neither, really, because Waddell, Arizona is not a town. We are a postal district. The Waddell Post Office was established by Donald Ware Waddell in 1934, when the area was a new emerging farming community. Now the town he envisioned never did materialize, but we continue to use that Waddell place name. Things have changed a lot in the decades that I have lived out here, so I began to wonder, as the farms around us vanish, will my Waddell disappear as well? See, because now, 90 years later, what used to be Waddell is now Surprise, Peoria, or Glendale, as those towns stretch out their western borders. So before all the farms get plowed under, let's take a look at our history. What was around here then, what's left, how Waddell was established, and why here? I think I'm one slide short. Here we go. So I've handed out some maps. You're not going to need it during the presentation. This just keeps you from having to make notes about where something is. You can just refer to it later. The map is also downloadable on our website right now, so if you didn't get one, there's more up here, or you can get it later. I'm going to be pretty fast and loose with the definition of Waddell today. The stories that I'm going to tell about these locations were once served or are now served by the Waddell Post Office, including a couple of areas that are outlying areas that help tell Waddell's story. Now, look at the map I've given you. These soft gray lines are the major roads. You know, they're all a mile apart. So I've labeled the major roads. And you see all these green and brown blocks? That's farmland, irrigated farmland. A lot of it is functioned by this line down here, the Beardsley Canal. The Beardsley Canal connects up to Lake Pleasant on the Awafria River, and it is the establishment of that canal and the irrigation water that is the start of Waddell, because water came down that and transformed the rangeland into farms and citrus orchards. It's the start of the Waddell place name. This is William Beardsley and his son Robert. They're from Ohio, and William Beardsley was Waddell's visionary. He had a plan to provide irrigation water to thousands of acres of the land west of the Awafria River. And he started in 1892 with private funding. And this was that dam, diversion dam on the Awafria River that eventually becomes Lake Pleasant. He started on a diversion dam, and after 3 years, work came to a halt. He ran out of money. William Beardsley ran out of money a lot. He had to file for bankruptcy. But not only was he our visionary, I think he must have been very charismatic, because he got a friend to buy up all of the equipment in the bankruptcy, who then just gifted it back to Mr. Beardsley. It was another 3 decades before William Beardsley's Awafria project came together in 1926. And in those 34 years, he never gave up on it. Now, success for the Awafria project depended on having landowners who would be the customers for the water he was going to deliver. this gray section here was very optimistic. Here's the White Tank Mountains. The dam and the lake would be up here. All of this. Of course, all that didn't happen. But his main problem was that most of that land was under the jurisdiction of the federal government. They would lease it if you wanted to ranch, but they weren't going to sell it. About the same time, the Roosevelt Dam project was coming together. And that was a federally funded project, where ours is privately funded. And the proponents of the Roosevelt Dam project were afraid that land out here would compromise their ability to sell land out that would serve the Roosevelt project. So Washington, D.C. said, no, we're not opening up that for sale. Well, they did not count on the creativity and determination of William Beardsley. He made a deal with the Santa Fe Railroad. It was a very complex scheme. What happened was the railroad went into negotiations with the federal government. The federal government wanted land that the railroad owned in northern Arizona. Land they wanted for the Hopi Indian Reservation. So a swap of land happened between the land they owned that's now in the Hopi Indian Reservation to where my house is now in Waddell. And with Mr. Beardsley's usual finesse, the deal with the railroad was not for cash. I think he put about 15% down. It was years before the railroad saw any of the rest of that money, if they were ever paid at all. Now, during the 34 years that Beardsley was working on that, eventually the laws changed that allowed for the establishment of water districts. A water district could issue bonds to cover the cost of these large dam projects. So he created the Maricopa Water District. Still in operation today, they supply me my irrigation water. This is Carl Pleasant. He's a young, handsome, accomplished engineer, young, in his 30s. He was the college football captain and the class president. Carl Pleasant has all the makings of being Waddell's hero. He was hired to design and build the irrigation dam that would be, at that time, called Lake Pleasant Dam, as well as the Beardsley Canal and the canal system that provides all that irrigation water. The construction contract was signed 5 days after the death of our visionary, William Beardsley. His son Robert took over the project at his death. This is Donald Ware Waddell, known as DW by his friends. And DW is Waddell's founder. He was part of the New York City firm of Brandon, Gordon, and Waddell. And they were the ones that bought that entire bond issue and resold to investors across the country. Since he had spent winters out here in Phoenix before, he was sent out here to oversee the project. And he found he enjoyed the project very much. He was soon involved in daily operations for the Maricopa Water District. And he also bought huge tracts of land out in the West Valley. Eventually, he bought a house in Phoenix and moved his wife, Florence, and his daughter, Eleanor, out from New York. Here's the original dam that Carl Pleasant built. At the time, it was the largest multiple arch dam in the world. And remember, the engineer that did it was in his 30s. It was completed in 1929, and now the Maricopa Water District managed all of the project. The Beardsley Canal started having water go down that canal, and all of that ranch land started to move over into farmland. Now, as the project was finishing up, there's a lot of buildings here that were no longer needed. A lot of them were moved or deconstructed and brought over. A lot of them ended up being buildings in Waddell. Waddell as a place name begins in 1934 with the creation of our post office. Now, D.W. Waddell platted out what he thought would be the town of Waddell on the northwest corner of Waddell Road and Cotton Lane. Now, the residential lots and streets you see here never did materialize. But the corner boasted the Waddell Ranch offices, a store with the post office in it, a gas station, and at one time, an outdoor dance floor. I have asked all our subsequent postmasters if they would put in an outdoor dance floor. No one's taken me up on it. This aerial view of Waddell in 1949 is of that same corner. You'll see here is the ranch offices, store, and at the east end here was a residence that D.W.'s daughter, Eleanor, and her new husband, and D.W.'s new business partner, Scott Libby. They moved in there. The store was ran by Sam Openshaw for many, many years. Now, active in land sales and farming, the Waddell Ranch, run by D.W. Waddell and Scott Libby, was run from this area for many years. This is Lola Taylor. Lola Taylor worked for the Waddells, and she was our first postmaster. Lola and her husband Jim had a ranch on Cotton Lane, about Peoria Avenue. Here's that same corner again in 1969, and I brought that because there we've added here, this is the Cotton Gym, the Waddell Gym. There's housing here and here for a lot of the permanent workers, a lot of the workers at the gym. Off the picture that you don't see are little black little squares that were worker cabins for migrant workers. You don't see those. The important thing is this thing right here. That's the office for the Cotton Gym. You see, our store and our ranch office seems to have been torn down. So they shoehorned our post office into the Cotton Gin office. Here's a photograph of that building. That building was tiny. It was so tiny that if our first postmaster, Lola Taylor, our second, Bert Boggs, or our third postmaster, Kay Rosen, if they were already busy with a customer, you had to wait outside for your turn. In '92, our new post office was built at Glendale Avenue and Cotton Lane, and it certainly gives us a better image. And we no longer have to park in the dirt. But the best thing about my post office, that bulletin board. Where else in the city can you see a bulletin board like this? It's a community board. We don't care who's America's 10 most wanted. I don't want to know who robbed a bank in Kentucky. I want to know who has extra citrus to give away, or whoever found my chicken. You can't see it because it's so close, but right there they said, it's a nice chicken. The Atchison-Topeka Railroad added a 12-mile railroad spur into Waddell in 1928, just as our area was opening up. The new rail line would provide freight service for the farms and orchards all through our area. Now, the 4 original sidings on the spur were named for men connected with the William Beardsley's Olive Free project. Starting at the mail line, it's where it connects to the main railroad line, you know, the railroad on Grand Avenue. It connected at the Beardsley Station, which is at El Mirage and Grand Avenue there. And then the rail line ran southwest till it got to Cotton Lane and ran down the west side of Cotton Lane all the way south to Indian School Road. The 4 sidings. The northmost siding was, of course, Waddell, so over by the store and the ranch offices. And then skip down to the Waddell, the one here that's on Glendale. That's called Brandon. Brandon was the associate of Donald Ware Waddell, the people that bought up all of those bonds and resold them to finance the construction of the dam. That siding was later referred to as Citrus Park for the grapefruit orchard and cannery that's on Citrus Road, just south of Northern, that we're going to come back to and talk about. The farthest south, you have Griggs. Griggs is reference to Charles E. Griggs. He was an engineer for the Maricopa Water District and the railroad at the time. And he was later superintendent of streets for the city of Phoenix. Now the Griggs station is also closest to Goodyear Farm, Southwest Cotton Company area. So later, that station was renamed McMicken in honor of Kenneth B. McMicken. He was the vice president and general manager of Goodyear Farms. Going back up to Cotton Lane and Olive is the Fenimore siding. Now that refers to Harry Melton Fenimore. He was a prominent attorney in Phoenix at the time, attorney for the railroad. His law firm is still in operation today. It's the longest, oldest law firm in the state of Arizona. Now, the Fenimore siding is the only one that is still used today by Fertizona, which is a fertilizer and agricultural product company. Most of the original spur was taken out in the 80s, and so they extended the Ennis spur along Olive Road to connect to the Fenimore siding. Now, Beardsley's achievements in opening up all this area for farming caught the attention of a man from California. This is Alexander Hirsch right here, signing documents for the purchase of, $50 million development that he called Romola of Arizona. Now, through his company, Pacific Development Company, you see here. They had put together a farming operation project in California where investors would buy specific acres of land, and then the company would do the planting, the watering, tending, marketing, harvesting, and then they would split the profits with the landowner. He had an opportunity to come to Arizona in the Waddell area and do that here. But rather than figs, which is I think what he was growing in California, it was grapefruit. Grapefruit was a very popular product at that time. Originally slated to cover 5 sections of land, which would be about 3,200 acres. It only ended up being planted in orchards in 2 of those sections. So if you live in Clearwater Farms Unit 1 or 2, you live in one of those sections. That's why our land, my deed refers to me as the Romola of Arizona Grapefruit Unit 43 or whatever it is. Now, the Romola of Arizona project may have been doomed from the beginning. Well, it starts up in 1929. It's the start of the recession. But I'm sure that Alexander Hirsch did not set this up as any type of a fraudulent scheme. He sent his brother-in-law, James Taylor, Lola Taylor's husband, our first postmasters. He sent him out here to manage the operation. Unfortunately, problems with the California operations had him diverting some of the money that should have been spent in Arizona to California. Land sales were never recorded, trees were not planted as promised, and soon charges of fraud were hounding Hirsch and the company executives. In 1931, Alexander Hirsch and 5 others were tried in Los Angeles for mail fraud and sent to prison. The land was reorganized, and the area became known as Citrus Park. In 1938, Waddell was at the center of a human tragedy caused by nature and the cotton industry. You see, cotton was a leading crop out here, and harvesting cotton was labor-intensive. Mechanical pickers didn't come in until the 50s. Migrant workers would be asked to come, lured into Arizona, to pick the cotton crop, and then urged to move on to California for the next crop, cantaloupe, apples, whatever it would be. So these cotton farmers had decided that they had such a huge crop planted that year that they weren't going to have enough pickers. So the farm industry distributed this flyer throughout other parts of the United States, warning the people here. Cotton farmers did have a record crop. Unfortunately, this program was too successful. They lured some 25,000 people to Arizona that year. So as the cotton harvest was finishing up in early 1938, the transient families were trying to move on to California. But January and February of that year in California, like this year, were torrential rains. It wiped out most of the crops in California, so there was no work. And it wiped out a lot of the roads to California. So there was no way to get there. So a lot of the migrants that had started for California had to come back to the Salt River Valley, joined by the people that hadn't yet moved on. So there's no work, poor living conditions, and little money to live on. Sickness and hunger soon ravaged all the camps. And one of the worst of those was the camp at the Waddell gym. After public outcry about the recorded conditions, the governor, Governor Stanford, public health officials, and of course the news media all descended upon our town. They found that many families were on the verge of starvation and widespread illness. Measles, whooping cough, and unfortunately typhoid fever was rampant in the camps. Fearing riots in the streets, finally, the Farm Security Administration provided cash grants to allow those workers to move on or to head home. Now, the remains of a prisoner of war camp were, 3 months ago I could say are, the remains of a prisoner of war camp were on the southwest corner of Cotton Lane and Olive Avenue in Waddell. It was officially called the Litchfield Branch Camp, and it housed German prisoners of war that were either stationed in Florence or most likely Papago. And they were brought out here to Waddell to pick cotton and work for the farmers out in this area. Alfred Dietrich, let's see if I've got a picture of him. I do. Alfred Dietrich was one of those prisoners. He was a corporal in the German Navy, serving in the submarine corps. You might know about some of his submarine mates, because those that were still at Papago were the group that did that lovely escape out of Papago with the thought of sailing down the Salt River to freedom. It didn't work out. But Alfred was sent out to the Litchfield camp to pick cotton. He said the work was grueling, but the food was decent. And he really enjoyed the fact that there was a sports field at the north end of the property where the prisoners could play soccer. There was a Jewish captain in charge of that camp, and so he showed the prisoners newsreels. And it was the first that many of them had heard about the atrocities that were going on against the Jewish people in their nation at that time. In '98, there were still some remnants of the camp, because after World War II, it goes to being a farm worker camp. So it was used for many years. It's hard to see because this is a terrible photograph. That's an iron stove. This was the kitchen building, and they had pulled the stove out of the kitchen building. A lot of these shacks were, once it was no longer a farm worker camp in the 50s, a lot of these shacks got dragged off for uses in other places. I know Duncan Farms had a couple of them. There was one up at the riding stables near White Tanks Mountain Park. I know a guy that has one in his backyard. I think his kids play in it. When it comes to farming, Colonel Dale Bumstead is Waddell's overachiever. The colonel carved out a large farming operation on both sides of Litchfield Road, north of Olive Road, and he called it Towleewee Ranch. He was one of the first in the nation to be a major supplier of cardinal grapes. Cardinal grapes was a dark red table grape, and it ripened earlier than all the other grapes. It was very popular at the time. In fact, I believe his first shipment of cardinal grapes to the East Coast were packaged up with gold ribbon bows on the package. But he raised not just award-winning grapes, but award-winning dates and cattle, and vigorously marketed himself and his ranch. And his fascination with new farming methods had him leading the way in water and soil conservation. His dedication to marketing and production improvements gave him an international reputation for farming innovations, which eventually caught the eye of the U.S. State Department. Tawiwi Ranch in Waddell was a popular stop for visiting dignitaries from around the world. Like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he was sent to America in 1947 by his father to view modern farming methods in desert climates. He eventually becomes the king of Saudi Arabia, but he spent so lavishly on palaces that his own family forced him out. I wonder what he thought of our little farming communities, sitting on the back porch of Dale Bumstead's Tawiwi Ranch. We also got a visit by the Shah of Iran in December of 1949. The King of Iran came to Tawiwi Ranch to view the operation on his tour through the United States. And he seemed very interested in Bumstead's conservation methods. He was said to ask many questions, which were dutifully written down by one of his aides, which I'm pretty sure wasn't this scary guy right there. That's the king or the Shah standing. Wrong button. Pardon me. That's the Shah, Colonel Dale Bumstead, and the Shah's holding the hand of little Martha McGeorge, who is the superintendent's daughter. The federal and state dignitaries attended a large luncheon on the property that day, and 50 palm trees that the Shah donated to Colonel Dale are still standing on the property, but no longer producing fruit. Still at Bumstead's Tawiwi Ranch, there are 3 houses on the west side of the road that are still standing. The Gonzalez family is leasing the property and living in them, so drive by, but don't drive in. There's people living there. The place that was around it, when you drive by it, you'll see it's just really lush. And it's a fraction of what it used to be. The people out here refer to it as the park, because Dale Bumstead's wife was quite the horticulturist. She brought plants in from all over the world. Gardeners were employed to daily water and keep this all up. A lot of the plants had name markers, and flowers were everywhere. On the east side of the road are the farming operations and also some worker residences. Dale Bumstead had some 20 houses in 3 separate little villages on the property. The buildings that are shown here are historic pictures, but those buildings are still in use today by G Farms that's leasing the property. And we are trying to nominate the entire property as a historic district in the National Register of Historic Places. Now, the Bumstead family sold the ranch to Robert McKee in 1977. Now, the current owner of the property, I believe they got it in 2005, is the city of Phoenix. They purchased the land in order to keep it in an agricultural district to protect Luke Air Force Base. But after almost 100 years of constant cultivation and only 3 owners, this landmark of the West Valley will soon be torn down. We are actively looking for photos, artifacts, oral histories, interviews of Bumstead's Tawiwi Ranch to preserve in our archives. I told you we'd go back to Citrus Park. This is an aerial view of 1949. And what started as Romola, Arizona, became Citrus Park. The farm operations are all here on the east side of the road. There's the cannery and packing sheds. There's some houses here for foremen. And on this side, it's hard to tell the little black squares from the trees, but those are all worker cabins. So the site was being built about the same time as the Olive Free project. So a lot of the items here for this housing and maybe even the cannery were leftover materials from the dam project that Carl Pleasant put up. This is a photo of some of the kids that are living at Citrus Park in 1948. By this time, the camp had been in use for some 20 years. But still, the worker cabins are one-room wooden cabins, no water, no electricity, maybe not even window glass. Just wood shacks without insulation. This building here that you see behind them was used, they were able to use as a Sunday school. I'm trying to document the fact that there was a school for black children on that site and that this was the building used. White and Hispanic children went to Litchfield Park for school. I'm always asked about the remains of the stone houses that are just west of our post office on Glendale Road. They were built by Elmer and Mary Andrews from rocks that they pulled out of the White Tank Mountains in 1949. Now they first came to Waddell in 1935 because Elmer had a job at the cannery in Citrus Park. And they lived in a worker cabin then. But later, when he became an ordained Baptist minister, his home church in Ohio helped him purchase a few acres of land in the grapefruit orchard. On the east side of their property, east of where these stone houses are, they built a wooden church. It burnt down, so there's no real remnants of it. The fun thing about the church was they had services in English in the morning and then lent the building out to the Hispanic community, so the services were in Spanish in the afternoon. I don't have any really good pictures of that church. What I have is an interior shot of the church. I know it had a second floor because one of Andrew's daughter and her new husband lived on the second floor of the church. And this photo is of the Hispanic community. That's the outside of the church there. The Hispanic community, they held fiestas on the property too, quite a bit. In 1939, Paul Litchfield, the CEO of Goodyear Tire and Rubber, began an apprentice farming program. The aim was to give deserving young men practical experience in farming, finance, marketing, and new farming machines. The reward of their hard work was the opportunity to purchase 80 acres of land from Goodyear Farms. This is a picture of some of those apprentices and their wives. They called themselves the Adamon Farm Cooperative. The Adamon Cooperative is east of Cotton Lane. It pretty much goes from the 303 to the Air Force Base and from Northern down to Camelback. So when you purchased your 80 acres of land, Goodyear Farms would drag out a building for you, like this one here, which was the start of many of the homes. This is a dairy that was on Saraville Road. Many of the farmers are still in possession of their original property, or their descendants are. But let's face it, second and third generations are not wanting to farm. And they're realizing huge profits selling the land for the new warehouse district along the 303. This field of melons will see a new building go up soon. Now, You and I may cringe at the thought of losing all this good farmland to development, but the Adamant apprentices and their descendants are skipping all the way to the bank. These developments have really driven up the cost of land. I know one land sale that went in like 5 years ago. For his 80 acres, he got $14 million. I wish my parents had been in. So let's talk a little bit about the road names in Waddell, because unlike a lot of the valley, we've got north-south streets with proper names, not just number designations. And some names reflect the obvious things about our area. Citrus, Cotton Lane, Citrus Avenue. Those are prominent crops at the time. Now, Cereal was the name that gave me the most grief in researching. I spent one full week looking for the Cereal family before I stumbled upon the truth. It stands for Salt River Valley. I think you all know. Now, this was a name that Goodyear Farms had put together to sort of market their cotton with the Cereal name. Now, my recent research about Bullard Road is really kind of iffy. So I'm putting out what I have, and then y'all can just tell me if I'm wrong or right. That would be fun. I think Bullard Road is named after George Purdy Bullard. He was Arizona's first Attorney General, and then after that he was a prominent attorney in the area and a proponent of roads, paved good roads in Arizona. He also sponsored the Cactus Derby, which was a race that happened from 1904 to 1908, anyway, something like that, to 1914. And it was a race from Los Angeles, California, to Phoenix, Arizona. Now, every year they took different routes. And of course, all the routes were on horrible dirt roads, so there would be a driver and a mechanic.
I need one.
The first year, it took 3 days. One year, the route went way north, and 2 of the drivers took a wrong turn and ended up in Colorado. But if you won the race, you won this really beautiful gold medal that said, the best driver in the world. Now this one I do know about. This is Nathaniel Martin Dysart. And Dysart donated land to start a school. Now, this area is off our map. It's not in Waddell, but we're talking about our streets here. The school is on Dysart Road, of course, and just south of Cactus. The nearest school at the time, in 1920, when he established this school, the nearest school was 5 miles away and across the Agua Fria River. And in those days, the river actually had water in it. So that was a plus. The Dysart School District is now huge. He donated land at least twice, and was on the school board for, I think, until his death, many years. Reams Road. This is A.J. Reams, and he moved his family to Waddell in 1933 to start a small dry goods store on 10 acres of land he owned on what would eventually become Reams Road, just north of Greenway. Now, many of his sons and son-in-laws all worked for Maricopa Water District, this is in the Arrows. And I asked Frankie Garcia, did you ever go into the Reams store? He says, oh yeah, I was in there a lot. But every time I went in there, there was a group of old men playing poker. So whether or not it was his, adorable smile, the fact that he had a store, or the continual poker game, they named a road after him. And a major one at that. When you drive down Northern Avenue, between Northern and along Glendale and Camelback, you're going to see Alsop Road. Now, Alsop Avenue. It's halfway between Cereal and Reams. And this road was named after a young man, Robert Alsop. Robert Alsop was part of the Apprentice Farmer Program, the admin group with Goodyear Farms. And in October of 1941, Robert put his training aside and joined the Army Air Corps during World War II. Now, Goodyear Farms was holding his place open for him on his return. Unfortunately, in March of 1943, he was killed in a plane crash in Hawaii while serving his country. His fellow apprentices thought well enough of him that they named the road after him in his honor. There's also an old meeting hall that was used by the Advent group for programs, picnics, birthdays. They used that for many years. It's still there as far as I know.
Yes, it's still there.
Along Bethany Home Road.
Yeah.
And it's much altered. They added this whole front section here. But it's in private hands at this point. D.W. and Scott Libby moved Waddell Ranch operations to the southwest corner of Cotton Lane and Indian School Road. And many of these buildings were recently the home of Duncan Family Farms. You'll remember it there. All of the buildings were torn down in 2017. Now here is foreman housing, worker housing. This is the ranch office here, and that's the store. You're looking north here. Way up here, there's a cotton gin up here. And there is one building here that was one of those cabins off of the POW site. They dragged it up there, and you know what? When I looked at it, you wouldn't recognize it. They had built all the way around it. It was no longer one of those little wooden shacks. Now by this time, Scott Libby, down here, was running the ranch, and D.W. was breeding polo ponies. Scott and Eleanor Libby moved out of the Waddell site down into Litchfield Park. Eleanor was an accomplished watercolorist. She was very prominent in the Valley arts community at the time. So on that same site, here's a picture of the Waddell Ranch office. I like the little W they formed holding up the front porch. Mr. Waddell, D.W. moved out to this area from Phoenix. The house is on Citrus, about south of Indian School Road. It's still there, it's still a residence, but it's not in the family anymore. Someone else owns it. And here is what was Pugh's store. It was also the store for the Duncan Farms Center for Demonstration Farming. I heard some interesting things about Mr. Pugh, that he wasn't exactly the most honest guy out there, but we'll leave that to another day when I've got some real proof. The lessons learned in the 1930s in America's Dust Bowl came to Waddell in 1947. The most effective technique was to plant trees as windbreaks. And in 1947, the U.S. Soil and Conservation District began distributing eucalyptus trees to farmers in Arizona for use on their private land. Many Waddell farmers took advantage of the program to plant the trees, and thousands of trees were planted around farm fields all over Waddell. This is an impressive line of trees that were along Cotton Lane, south of Indian School Road. These trees are now over 70 years old. Road widening has caused the removal of many of the trees, and all the trees around Waddell are dying off, mostly from lack of water. Because for decades, the farmers would run an open irrigation ditch past the trees. Well, as those are going away, those trees are dying off from lack of water. But those that still exist are still providing the job of breaking the wind and relief from the heat. If Waddell was a town and we had a Chamber of Commerce, it would certainly talk about the roses grown in Waddell. Most of the container roses sold in the United States are grown in this area. If you have the opportunity, see these little, and you're on the sort of south side of the field, see these little white markers? That tells you what type of rose is in that row. And it really smells good. In recognition for D.W. Waddell's work with the Maricopa Water District, the dam that Carl Pleasant built was renamed the Waddell Dam in 1965, shortly after his death. Barry Goldwater spoke at the dedication. Before his death, D.W. had created a charitable foundation for education and cancer research, and it was run by his daughter, Eleanor. And one of the first contributions or donations that Eleanor made was 140 acres of land for the elementary school named after her husband, Scott L. Liddy. The foundation was administered by Eleanor until her death in 2002, and more than $7 million in donations were made. Besides the grade school, there's a prestigious award for cancer research at U of A. There's a lecture series on cancer research, and many of the art museum endowments in the valley are due to the Waddell Foundation. There's also a Scott Libby amphitheater at the Heard Museum. Now, the Waddell family legacy is impressive, but I think more important is the legacy of the many other families who made Waddell their home. They worked here, grew up here, passed the land down to their children. Many still have homes here, some 70 plus years later. These Waddell stories are the ones I cannot tell. They must speak for themselves. And I hope to archive as many of their memories as I can. I've touched on a few of the events that have shaped Waddell, and I hope you'll take the map and reflect on the events that happened here. Events that are now, even now, passing into our memory. The Beardsleys, Dale Bumstead, D.W. Waddell, the Libbies, Reams, Dysart, many others were a positive force for Waddell. And as we look back, will we be able to recognize our area's past for very much longer? Now we need to look to those who grew up here. Second, third, even fourth generations who can share their memories of what Waddell was like before it all vanishes. I'm done. You were so welcome. I know it takes a long time, so, if you have to leave for your tennis game, please do, but I will answer any questions you have. And, yes, ma'am?
You touched on the admin.
Yes.
area. Do you know anything that's going to be happening with, since the farm days are going away from the admin area?
Most of the admin area is, they're sort of, putting the plots together and selling it for distribution in warehouse centers. Some are not. I mean, they have their options. Some of the original admin areas were broken up into smaller sections and sold. So, I have a friend with just 1.5 acres out there, living off Sarahville Road. So there's still a lot of residential there. There's a guy that's been selling pigs there for as long as I've known the place.
So they're planning on keeping the irrigation going for admin area?
The admin has their own water district. They pump water, and yes. Yeah. You'll see the admin water district main offices on the corner of Sarahville and Glendale, if you can get there, because those roads are all under construction this week. Anybody else? Oh, yes, I know.
Okay. I have a question about, do you have any insight on the origin of the Talwee Ranch?
Yes, isn't that odd? Dale Bumstead brought in a friend of his who was a Hopi artist and asked him to name the place. This gentleman said he would name it Talwee, which stood for the land the sun first shines upon. A lot of people around here don't know it as Talwee. They know it as Bumstead's Ranch. So we kind of try to answer, or try to put both names in everything whenever we talk about it. So, yeah, the land, the sun first shines. That's pretty romantic, isn't it? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with Larry, but yes, I just hope to speak from Talwee Ranch. We were actually part of that same area to the penalty, so it's filled up.
Yeah.
But anyway, as the story goes, from what I understood and talking to various individuals, the date trees that are still there, as the center for the shop, we went, came and visited with Mr. Postman to find out about the good practices of farming.
Yes.
He brought some seedlings from Iran as a gift to Mr. Postman.
And those trees are the descendants.
And they planted them on the ranch, and from what I understood in talking to various individuals, those seedlings came from King Solomon's garden.
I had heard that.
Yeah.
King Solomon, who knew that?
And they did produce a lot of dates, but you have to propagate to produce.
You do have to propagate.
dates, but they're still there, so we.
If you drive by, you'll see on the east side of the road, there's a couple of strings of the date palms. And then kind of north of them a little bit and offset is the male version of that palm.
Yes.
The ones all in there are the female version. Well, you pretty much have to hand pollinate
Right.
these dates. So that's why they're not producing right now. But the descendants of those trees and the male tree that they used to pollinate are still there. It's G Farms is doing it now. If you need to buy horse pellets, that's a great place to go. Yes, hi.
Hi, Karen. Interesting facts about Citrus Park. In the late 20s, maybe early 30s, believe it or not, with California and Florida in the citrus business, that was the largest continuous citrus farm under one management in America.
Oh, wow.
And that they had a huge advertisement for that and a double page of one of the New York newspapers in color, trying to sell the lots which Karen talked about earlier. You could buy a 5-acre lot in the Romola farming experience, let's call it. And it's kind of interesting to know that that was the largest farm in America under one management for citrus in the middle of the Arizona desert.
Well, it's like this photo here. See all those little black dots? Every one of them is a grapefruit tree. And that, I'm just looking at a part of Citrus Park. It went from Northern down to Glendale and a couple things wide. There was a lot of them. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know how much they were selling them?
I do not. At one time I thought I did, but it's sort of like, you know, second or third hand, so I can't really confirm it. Plus, the other problem is that the land sales were never really recorded. So, you know, some people showed up at their fraud trial saying, I put $15,000 towards this and I haven't seen a penny. I know of one lady that when Clearwater Farms started building houses there, one lady, her descendants showed up and said, my aunt owns this acre. Well, it had the Keenan's house on it. And so being able to gather all that land up out of that horrible debacle and reorganize it as Citrus Park was a huge undertaking and evidently not always successful. So, yes.
Do you have any more information on the family that built the stone house on Glendale and 175th? And why is that plot not part of Clearwater Farms?
It was not part, a lot of that section of Clearwater Farms was added in little bits later. Even stuff that is now wasn't originally in 1982. But the people that owned that 6 acres didn't want to be part, and so therefore they were not. The Andrews were known as having it was a place of, you know, getting like a food bank. They would get members of their church and they'd go out and glean or pick and process dates. And if they had more, they'd take it all downtown to Phoenix and sell it and then use the money to buy food so it was kind of like a food bank in our area for a while, privately funded and somewhat small. I have a picture of them giving away clothes to children. However, Dorothy, the woman I interviewed, daughter, Mary and Elmer Anderson, she remembers waiting to pick up a bus to go to school. She went to public school. And all the kids had coats but her. So,
We give away clothes for the daughter to vanish.
who knows when that's scheduled? I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, they moved to Buckeye after, when the mechanical cotton pickers came in, the worker camps were really all emptying out. So they moved to Buckeye in the 50s. All right, you have your map. You're going to go to that table and you're going to grab one of these. And you're going to join us because we're worth joining. It's only 25 bucks, honestly. And that way, you're a captive audience for all of our future programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.